Hey everybody, welcome to the Airbyte Connector Builder demo session today. This is actually the first one of 2024, so we're really excited to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and just quickly do some introductions while we wait for people to filter in and get ready to dive into building a connector. So first things first, with me today, I have Keith Maxwell. Keith and I are part of the solutions engineering team here at Airbyte. Our role is to make sure that our users for both our cloud and our open source product are successful in setting up their pipelines, getting their data moving, answering any of the technical questions you have. And that also involves in helping you build your connectors. We want to make sure that you're able to get your data from wherever it is to wherever it needs to be. And we're really excited about the tools we've put forth to help you do that. Today, our focus will be in showing you how to build a connector from a REST API and how easy that is to do. And so we're hopefully going to answer a lot of the questions along the way. But if you do have questions as we're going along, feel free to use the questions tool in the platform. So Keith is here. He'll be answering those async as I go along and kind of give you a demo of the platform and the tool. So please throw those in there. But before we get started, it's also really interesting to see where people are coming in from. So if you don't mind, if you just want to drop in the chat, just say, hi, I'm coming in from, I'm coming in from Nashville today. I think, Keith, you're over in New York. Just want to throw that in there. It's great to see. We also would love to see what API sources you're looking at. If you have a particular REST API you're interested in building a connector for, let us know. We always want to make sure that we have compatibility across the ecosystem. So getting a feel for what our users are trying to do really helps us to make sure we're building the right tools for you. That said, as I think users are doing that, and it's great to see, we have a really global group. That's wonderful. It's one of the great parts about Airbyte being an open source company is we have a really wide user base. This goes across both our cloud and our open source products. And it's always wonderful to see that adoption. So for those who aren't familiar, Airbyte is a open source ELT tool. Our goal and mission when we launched Airbyte was to cover what we call the long tail of connectors. These are the connectors that you might not find in your traditional iPaaS ELT tool software out there that say, is a Salesforce, is a Jira, is maybe a Google or a LinkedIn. These are the ones that maybe a little bit more bespoke to you. Some of the early examples I remember working with are like APIs revolving around like pets and maybe like lost animals. That's like a great example of one that you're not going to find in your traditional SaaS tool, but we want to make sure you have the tools to support, and that's what we call the long tail. The other key thing about Airbyte, and I'm going to focus a little bit on this today and give you an actual example, is we are really flexible and extensible. So this means, and it goes really to our open source framework, that you can customize Airbyte to fit your specific needs. So whether that's taking one of the connectors we've built already and adding maybe a new stream or changing the way you incrementally load data or how we send account information, Airbyte's designed so that you can customize it to fit your needs. Now, the reason this is important is generally in this space, you'll see two different types of solutions. Historically, you have like the large iPaaSes or even like the ELT SaaS providers. They offer you solid solutions if you fit within their framework. So if you need to use specifically the Jira streams they have or the Salesforce streams they have, great. But if you need something a little bit different, you're kind of stuck. They don't offer you a tool to build it. Alternatively, a lot of our users have come from a world where they've built these themselves. I know I've built my own ELT pipelines, and I'm sure many of you have as well. But that also requires your own maintenance. And when you have people roll and transition off, it creates some tech debt and lots of headaches. Our goal is to really kind of thread the needle and fit that gap where we can give you a tool to use, but also not necessarily lock you into particular infrastructure. You don't have to sink any time really into building around Airbyte, but you also have a lot of like the synergy you get on building around a structure that is designed to do this. And I'll show you an example of what I mean. Let me actually just jump right in. So today we're going to be building with the API random user generator, randomuser.me. It generates random data and is actually a useful tool if you want to like seed a database. But before I get there, I want to show an example of how I mean that we're flexible. So if you come in, Airbyte is an open source tool. So you can come into our GitHub repo. You can see all of the connectors we have. Here's all of our destinations. You'll see all of our sources. I'm going to look for Pendo. Let's see if we can find source Pendo. Here it is. So Pendo is one of our low-code connectors. And when I say low-code, we have a YAML format that you can show right here that outlines how you want to pull data from various APIs. So in the builder session I'm going to use a UI. That UI actually is just generating a YAML behind the scenes, and that's actually what's powering everything. So you can absolutely use the builder. You can also go in and use the YAML and add properties in there. You can also layer in custom code. If you want to use a Python blurb to do some functionality that we don't have, you can absolutely do that. But one of the things that's really neat, let's go in. If we just download this here, say grab that, I can come into Airbyte. Let's go into the platform itself. And one quick housekeeping note, I'm going to assume most users have familiarity with Airbyte either on the cloud or open source side. So I'm not going to really show that component today. If you want to join one of our other demo sessions where we dig into how to set up connections and the basics of Airbyte, we can send over some links, and we have scheduled time to do those as well. But let's jump into the builder. These are ones I've already built. But what I want to show is I can create a new custom connector. I can take that YAML that I just downloaded from Pendo. I can say we have it here. Let's grab Pendo. And I can actually load this directly into my account. In a way, it's kind of like cloning it out of the repo, but specifically to your workspace. And now you can come into, say, the feature request stream, and you can customize the stream in whatever way you want. Maybe you want to use a different primary key. Maybe you want to add a custom query parameter or change the way we handle incremental syncing. This is the power of Airbyte. As you build around some of these sources, you can easily take any of the ones we've already built and customize them for your own use cases, load them into your workspace and use them as you fit. Or if you want, you can also contribute those back to the main repo and share those with other users. So a lot of flexibility and a lot of power in what that can do. But today, most of our focus is going to be around spinning up a new connector from scratch. So let's go ahead and dig into that. One of the things I'd recommend, and let me drop a link to these docs here, is I picked this particular API because it's really easy to follow along with. You don't have to have an API key. So if you already are in your Airbyte instance or you're not, I would encourage you to get there, whether it's cloud or open source. Pull it up. If you're in open source, make sure you're on one of the latest versions so you have access to the builder. If you don't have a cloud account, really easy to sign up for one, and you can do that while we're getting all of this put together. So I would encourage, follow along. Everything I'm doing, you can do as well. So all right, let's jump into the builder. I'm going to build one from scratch here. You can see these are ones that I've already drafted. We have various versions. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's hit the new custom connector. It's going to give us three options. So I showed you how we can import a YAML. This can be anything that you find in our repos or otherwise. You can also riff off an existing one you've already built. So if I hit this, I can say I've already done some legwork here. I'm just going to reuse that. But today, I'm going to hit start from scratch. First thing it's going to ask for is us to name it. So in this case, we're going to make a source that generates random user data. So I'm going to call this random user generator. And it's going to ask us for the API base URL. So for a lot of this demo, I'm going to be jumping back and forth between the docs. If you have multiple screens, I would encourage setting those up so you can do that. But today, we're just going to hop over here. These are the docs for this particular project. It's going to talk to us about the particular API source. And here is the URL we want to use. So I'm going to grab that. This one is actually pretty simple in that the base URL is just that domain, randomuser.me, and it has one stream, the API stream that we'll see here in a second. The other reason I like this one is it doesn't actually require any authentication. So I'm just going to leave this as no auth. If you want to see an example where we have authentications, we have some previous demos that we can link you where you can see how we set up using API keys, bearer tokens, or OAuth. We also have great docs. The team has put a lot of time and energy into making sure that this is as self-led as you need it to be. And so if you click this link here, why don't you just pull that up in a new tab, this will walk through how to set up any of the various auth forms that Airbyte offers. The engineers who built this have set up some videos that show you how to configure it. And so I really would encourage spending time here in the docs. It will help answer any of the questions you have. And for those of us who like to use ChatGPT or other AI tools, you can also point them to the docs and use that to answer your questions. And be like, how do I set up a OAuth, and point that to ChatGPT, and it can actually pull from our docs and help you answer some of those questions. But let's go back here. We're going to use no auth in this case. It makes it really simple. So the first thing we need to do is add a stream. So if you see the plus button over here, once we have a stream, we can get into the real nitty gritty of what the connector builder can do. So I'm going to actually just call this one random data because that's what we're going to be generating. And then the URL path is simply API. I could add the slashes. You don't need to add the slashes, whatever mechanism you prefer there. All right, so we now have a stream. We have the auth method selected, in this case, no auth, and we have the base URL. That's all we really need to get going. So one of the things I will always encourage our users to do is test all the time. Like every time you make a change, just run a quick test. If you've used Postman, it's very similar of a feel to you put in the creds, let Postman do the actual calls and heavy lifting for you. And that's what this platform is designed to do as well. So let's run a test. This will tell us if there's any errors. If we saw a particular issue with the API, it would respond and say, hey, here's an error. It's a 500 error, 400 error, whatever the case may be. And so we can actually see what's happening behind the scenes. So let's peel back here. So I'm going to start with the request. So what we're actually doing is just issuing a request to this particular API. So you see we have our base URL that we outlined. We have the particular stream, in this case API, as well as some just basic stuff like we create a user agent and such for this particular call. We get the response back. So we got a 200, which is great. You have the body of the response and just some of the data with the response as well. I'm going to come back to detected schema in a second. So let's jump over to records. What you'll see here is we actually have what we see is like two records. We have the results and we have info. Now, if we jump into the response and scroll down, you can see info, which is like some metadata about the response itself. You can actually turn that off in this API, but we don't really care too much about it. It's good to have, but we can ignore it. The data we actually want is here under results. And so we would actually call that a record selector. So I can come over here and say, where is the data I'm interested in? And let's tell it and say, let me put that in as results. If I rerun this, what you're going to see is that we're going to ignore results and actually dig into all of the data that's nested underneath. So now we see gender, name, location, email, date of birth, phone. This is the actual data we're really interested in creating this artificial data. One of the things I generally encourage is working from the JSON array format. The table format is actually really helpful if you want to get an idea of what your data is going to look like in your end destination. Commonly, our users are setting to Snowflake, BigQuery, or maybe a Google Sheet, which is what I'll do in this example today. But this gives you a good feel of what it's going to look like. Here, though, it just kind of unnests it all and gives you a feel for what the data actually is. And I'll find that really useful as I'm working on building this particular connector. So, all right, let's jump back. One of the things you'll see here is we have gender, we have female, we have name. Underneath name, we have these nested objects. I'm going to spend some time today on digging into those and how we can unnest them. But before I get there, I'm just going to work my way down chronologically, essentially, through the options we have in the builder. I'm going to touch on some of them today, and I'm not going to hit on everything. And we can direct you to other sessions or some of the docs on the things that we don't necessarily get to. So, primary key. When you're setting up a connection or a new source, we generally recommend having both a cursor and a primary key. A primary key gives us a way to dedupe the data once we landed in your destination. That way you can ignore things like duplicates, or you can pull the latest record. You don't always have a good primary key, so it's very much source dependent. Let's take a look and see if there's something in this data we can use as a primary key. Let's go jump back into this. So if we jump down here, you can see that maybe we have this login. We have a UUID. That's actually something great we can use. So let's use that. I'm going to type login, and I'm going to say it's actually underneath login. It's the UUID. Cool. Again, every time I do something, I want to run a test. And one of the things we can do for you is we'll actually look to see if that's a unique primary key. If we chose a bad one, maybe I'll show an example here and see if this works. And I throw gender. We should get an error that says, hey, gender is actually maybe not necessarily a great primary key. We might see that here. In this case, we're not seeing it. It's because we only have one record. So I can come back and resolve that. But we do some alerting to help you create a good source. And so once I load a few more records, you'll see that it says, hey, gender is actually a pretty poor primary key. And so let's come back to that. We'll come back to that here in 1 second. So now we have a good set primary key. So one of the things I called out is right now we're only getting one record back. By default, this API will only return one record if you just call the base URL. We actually want to get a little bit more data to make this more useful. This will also help our schema inference. So let's jump into the docs. And scrolling through the docs, we'll see that if we scroll down, requesting multiple users, we want to use the results parameter. So there's a couple different ways we can do it. Looks like we can set a max of 5,000. We don't need that many for our purposes, so we're just going to use something a little bit smaller. So let's close that out and come back into the builder. So there's a couple different ways we can actually pass this information to the API. And again, Airbyte was really designed to be flexible and support as many use cases as possible. So I'm going to start with the simplest. We can actually just hard code this. So let's say we're going to pass the query parameter of results equal to, let's call it 100. Again, let's run a test. And now what we should see is that we should get back 100 records instead of just that one. That's exactly what we see. So now we have 100 artificial records with generally the same set of data. Let me show that gender example I was showing earlier. So if I pick a bad primary key, there you go. In this case, it's saying primary key isn't set. It can't find what it's looking for. And let's say I can set it to gender. Say that's not a unique, found male more than once, which is expected. So not a good primary key. All right, let's hit login and UUID. Oh, I mistyped it. And cool. All right, now we have a good primary key again. All right, so you can set really any query parameter, any header you'd like, and that will, thank you, team. I appreciate you making that the bigger screen. All right, so it looks like I think there was an issue with showing the screen is smaller. I think it looks like Chris fixed that. Thank you, Chris. Are we good to go? Yep, awesome. Cool. All right, jumping back in. So where were we? We're at results. So we set results to 100. Now we have 100 different results. And you can jump back in. You can see we have a lot more data here to work with. So I'm going to focus on the schema detection for a quick second. One of the most painful things to do when you're setting up these types of sources and replications is identifying the schema of your data. That's going in and saying, this is a string, this is an integer, this is whatever type it is. And so we actually try to make that really easy on you. So we come over to this detected schema tab. It's actually going to look at all of the data that's provided in those 100 records, and based on that inference, generate a schema for you. And so if we come over here to declared schema, I have automatically import detected schema selected. That's going to say, great, we're looking at age. Age is a number. We have date. In this case, maybe it's a string, or if it's, depending on how it is, could be a date time. And so we're going to try to do our best based on the data we're seeing. One of the things I'd recommend as you're building out a source, use as large of a pool of data as you can to really get a proper schema. So sometimes objects can be null, but if we only sample 100 records, we might not see that. So get as big of a sample size as you can. That's really good for inferring the schema. You can also come in and manually modify it. I can uncheck this and say, I'm going to make this, I don't know, maybe I'll make this a string or otherwise. So again, full flexibility in how you control that. But for now, let's just let the system automatically handle it for us. Great. Back into the here, we can set any custom headers and custom objects in the body. We get a lot of flexibility in what data we pass into those APIs to make sure that we're getting out what you need from it. All right. I'm going to show pagination for a second, but I'm going to give a big disclaimer. This API is a little bit unique. Most APIs you're going to be working from, you're going to have a limited amount of data. So maybe you're pulling from, I use Jira as an example, and you have 1,000 Jira issues you're going to pull data from. Once you hit 1,000, we'll stop pulling data because we'll hit the end. This will actually just keep generating data for you. And so you have to be a little bit careful in how we configure this, because we can just keep requesting pages and upon pages upon pages. So I'm going to show you how to use it, but we're going to just, again, if you're creating this on your own, just be careful on how you configure it. So, and you'll see what I mean here in a second. For pagination, a lot of the tooling that you have to use to interact with these APIs is built into this platform for you. And so how you think about pagination is one such example. So we have 3 different modes we generally support: offset, page-based, and cursor-based. This one uses page-based incrementals. So if we jump into the docs, we can scroll down. And I think here it is. It talks about pagination. It says we can request multiple pages when we use a seed using essentially just page equals 3. So let's go ahead and set that up. Page size, this is the number of results. So let's say we'll set this to 100. Start from page, we jump back into the docs. It says it's base index 1. So we can just say start from page 1. We want to inject page size into the outgoing request. This is actually in results. And so one of the things I'm going to have a problem with here is I'm now defining results in pagination and as a hard-coded query parameter. That's not great. So we actually want to get rid of this. Otherwise, we're going to have a conflict there. And then lastly, where do we set page number? Most of the time, that's just going to be page. And you have the option to inject on first request. When I set this up, what we should see is that we get 5 pages of data. The builder by default will only limit to 5 pages. It does this just to help with speed and efficiency of setting up your connections, but give you a feel for what you'd expect from multiple pages. So you see down here, now we're seeing those 5 different pages. All right, so I can jump through. You'll see we have actually a lot of data on these. And again, this is great for inferring that schema. So great. All right, so we are now set up on pagination. And this is something that technically right now, if we just wanted to deploy this into our Airbyte workspace, we can absolutely do that. I'm going to do a couple other things here to make this data a little bit more useful. And let's jump down to show you those. So incremental syncs. So most of the time where you can, I'd strongly encourage setting up an incremental sync. When you're doing an incremental sync, what we're going to point to is a cursor. A cursor commonly is a timestamp. Think of like a last updated date. This will allow us to only pull new data. So for example, if we set this up properly here, we'd run it today. And then when we run tomorrow, we won't pull any historical data. We'd only pull the diff from today and tomorrow. This makes your calls significantly more efficient, but it does depend on the functionality of the API. Not all APIs can support cursors. Not all of them have good timestamps to use or have the ability to actually filter based on those timestamps. This is a good example of one that doesn't have that ability. I can't give it an API, a timestamp and say only generate data greater than this particular timestamp because it generates fake data. It does have a timestamp in here I could technically use, and I can actually, if we have time, I can show an example of how to configure that. But it's not a great candidate for setting up incremental syncs. The one caution I will give, this is really worth reading the docs on. If you set it up wrong, you could really easily lead to missing data. So be very careful. If you have any questions, reach out to us. But setting up a bad cursor is one of the most common symptoms we see of missing data, where it's like, oh, I should have this data, but I don't. That typically can be associated with how you set up your incremental sync and your cursors. A good example being using something like a created date. A created date can be used as a cursor, but if you have any new data that comes in after and that created date isn't updated, we're going to ignore it and you're going to miss that data. So let's come back to that if we have some time. Jump down. I'm not going to use parent stream in this case. Parent stream is really useful if you need to call another API endpoint to get a, say, like an ID that you use to call a second endpoint. So this is like where you're nesting calls. First going to call endpoint 1. That's going to return some data, and I'm going to use that data to call endpoint 2. A lot of APIs do this behavior. We call this with their parent stream. All you would do is first set up that parent stream. So I'm going to call this stream first. And I'm going to say I'm going to point to a particular key in that, and then I'm going to pass that into this child stream to essentially increment through all of those values. In this case, we're a simple API. We don't need to necessarily do that. Parameterized requests. I can actually set up an example of doing this here. So I mentioned earlier how this one will run forever if we set up pagination, since it'll just always generate data for us. So let's actually turn off pagination. And I can show you how we can set this up here. This one, you can say, let's run for a list of values. So I want to say, I want to pull the first 5 pages. So I can say 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's actually just use 4. As you can see, a difference in how we run with pagination. I'm going to inject a parameter value into outgoing request. So I'm going to say, I'm going to inject this into page. And it's going to say page equals 1, page equals 2, page equals 3. And let's just call this page limit. Just create a variable for that. And if I set this up as it is, we have results as a record selector, primary key. Should get 1 result per page, I believe. Let's see if that works or if we get an error. There we go. Yep. So I'm getting 1 record per what we call partition. If I go to partition 2, partition 2, partition 3, partition 4. This really isn't necessarily the ideal way to set up this particular API. It's more of just like showing how you can use this functionality. You can use a hard-coded list. You can also ask the user to provide a list. This is really useful. Say if you have multiple account IDs you want to iterate through, you can have the user provide that as an input, and we can actually iterate through those account IDs. So let's go ahead and just turn that off. I'm going to come back here, and let's add that query param results equal to 100. So you have some more data to work with. Again, run a test every time we make changes. Cool. All right, let's jump down. I'm going to do error handling and transformations real quick. So error handling, you won't actually see the result of what you configure here in our testing, but it's more for when you deploy this to production. There's a lot of flexibility in how you can configure this. Let's go ahead and take a look at the docs. I think he has some materials on errors. So here you see API errors. If there's a problem for whatever reason, it'll just generate the string and says, we can actually use that. We can use what we call our substrings. Say, let's look for a particular substring in the response. If we see the concept of we can say, hey, this is a problem, and let's just fail the job right there. More commonly for maybe like a larger API, you could use like an error code where they issue a particular error code. And based on that error code, you can either set, hey, let's back off and maybe we've been throttled and we just need to wait 5-10 minutes before we make calls again, or we should just fail this entirely. Maybe it's a key auth issue or whatever the case may be. So we can let that live and move on to transformations. All right, transformations. So this one I said I would come back to, and I think it's actually pretty important here. So we offer you the ability to do really two types of transforms in the builder itself. You can either remove data. So if there's maybe a particular stream you don't want to expose to your end users or yourself, you can just say, drop it, ignore it, we don't care about it. So for example, like if I don't care about gender, I can put gender in here. If we rerun, you'll see that gender should no longer be surfacing in the results. And great, you don't see gender here anymore. Alternatively, though, we can also add a field. This is where you can get pretty creative in how you build this. So the simplest form, and what I wanted to show earlier, is I want to unnest some of this data. So you saw that we have a lot of nested data here. So instead of just like a name, we have name, title, name first, name last. One of the fundamental philosophies of Airbyte is that we try to be true to the source API. So a lot of APIs will pass through nested data. And by default, that's how we're going to pass it to our end destinations. We want to give you the flexibility in how you normalize that data and how you handle it. But some cases, like this is a good example, where you just want the random data, you don't want to have to deal with that normalization. You can handle that here in the builder itself. And so let's go ahead and actually do that. We can use name as an example. So first thing it's going to ask for is where I want to put this new data. So I'm going to say, let's put title, will be a new field we're going to create. And then for the value, I'm going to point to a particular item or record that we're getting back from the API. So let's use this here as an example. I like to copy these over. So it's saying point first to this particular record and then to this one here. So in this case, we're going to use name as the first one. So I can just replace this. And then I want title out of it. Let's do that. And great. Again, let's run a test. What we should see now is at the end of all of this data, if we scroll over to the right, we now have a new field called title. And that is essentially unnesting that. We could do this multiple times. Let's just go ahead and do this a couple more times real quick. And we can show, let's do a first name. Nope. Missed a letter there. Let's jump back. A little bit of lag on my keyboard. Actually, sorry, I need this like that to add field. Try that again. All right. First name. Let's copy you. And we'll see here, we have name. And then in this case, I think they use first. Cool. All right. And let's run test again. So now we should see a first name. So I think for this particular API, one of the things I'm going to do later, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it right now, is I'm just going to actually unnest a lot of this data. So our users would have to worry about dealing with that once we generate it. But if we come down here, there we go. We see title and we see first name. And so for everything here, we can unnest all that and bring it up to the top level. I think we're good there. The last thing I want to show is adding some user input variables you can have. So let's jump over here to user inputs. So for testing, it's fine. I hard-coded. If we go back into this thing, you can see that I hard-coded the results. But let's say we don't actually want to hard-code that. Let's go in and create a user input so you can say what I want those results to be. So I'm going to say this is going to be, we can call it whatever we want. We'll call it results. And then under hint, and say number of records to return. We're going to type it. In this case, we can use an integer. That's fine. Or you can use a number and say, is this a mandatory field or required field? In case it's not, if you don't include it, we'll just return 1. Or you can also have a default value. So let's go ahead and hit create. If I come into testing values up here in the top, it's going to say, here's the optional fields you have, results. I'm going to set it to 50 so we can see the difference. I'm going to hit save. And now again, we have a conflict. We have it as a variable and we also have it hard-coded. So let's get rid of the hard-coded version. Let's run test. If this is working, we should see 50 results. It looks like it's not. So let's figure out what happened. This is actually a great example. Not one I planned for, but let's take a look at the request itself. So you can see here, we didn't actually pass it through. So let's figure out why we didn't. So we have results is 50, user input. Let's take a look here. So I know why. So I came in here. Let's go back to the query params. So I actually left it out here. So we created this variable called results, but by default, we're not going to pass that through. We have to tell it how to pass it through. So now I'm going to say I'm going to have the key results and the value, instead of being hard-coded to 100, which is what we had before, let's actually point to this variable we created, results. And you see config results. Let's run a test now, and we should actually see that. Awesome. Now we're getting 50 records back. So you can create any type of user inputs you want. It could be an array, say a list of comma separated values. It could be a date. It could be a variable like that. So if you're thinking authentication data, that's commonly if you want to add an API key, if you want to add a username, that's how you're going to add that type of data there. So great. I think we're feeling pretty good about this. We have a lot of data coming through. Everything we've done before is passed. I think I'm pretty happy where this sits. I'm going to add one more user variable here. So something that's interesting in this particular API is we can set a seed. So let's see where I can find seeds. A seed allows you to repeat the results you're getting. So I could put in Airbyte, and every single time I'll get that same set of data for every time you use the seed Airbyte. So let's go ahead and just generate that real quick. Let's call this one seed. Seed to generate your data. And it's going to be a string, not a required field. If you have it, great. If you don't, it'll just randomize it. And come back in here, and let's add a query param. It's called seed. And I'll show you an example here. Let's go ahead and put that. I don't actually have to have seed configured. Let's try running it without it, see what happens. If we come into the request, you will see here we passed results as 50, but because seed was left blank, we're not actually going to send it through. We're going to have some intelligence behind that, but I can come in here and say seed, let's run seed to Airbyte, run it again, and you'll see in our particular request, we should get different data. Well, we might be overloading the API server now. We have a lot of users sending this. So there we go. I got that one through. Seed, Airbyte, awesome. And so the 500 was interesting. So you will see as you're working with various APIs, and I think we have a lot of people who are sending requests to this one, it's possible that we could get, say, just denied on their side. And so we'll try to surface those errors as you see in the builder so you can deal with them then. But I think we're pretty comfortable with where this one sets. So I want to show you what it looks like to actually deploy it in a workspace. So let's jump ahead to do that. But before I do, I talked earlier about how all this builder is doing is actually generating the YAML file. So I want to show you, if we jump over here for a second, everything we did was just configuring this file. So you can actually export this file. You can check it in with GitHub. You can do whatever you want with it now, and has all the work that you've already established. You can see here it has the schema that it auto-detected. It has the variables we created, results, and seed. It's all that, everything we built here exists in that YAML. You can also just export. If you hit export, you download it, and you have it there. But if we jump back into the UI, what I want to show here is I'm going to publish this to our workspace. So when I hit publish, it's going to ask me how I want to name this. So just because I named it something here doesn't mean how I necessarily have to pass it to the workspace. This is what other users could see if you're maybe sharing your workspace with your team members. But I can use random user generator. I'm going to say just a quick version release. Initial release of this connector. This is important because you can actually generate a lot of versions. You can revert versions as well. So I'll show that here in a second. So I'd encourage including some good notes so you know what you did with each of your releases. If we come into here, come into connections and then builder, you'll see for SeatGeek, which is one we've used in previous demo sessions, we have 9 different versions. I can actually click in and say, here I redid the schema, or here we added maybe a client ID. And so I can actually revert to each one of these. If I wanted to go, let's go back to V6. Great, we can now just revert to V6. Or if I want to come back to V9, no problem doing that. And you'll also see here, we should be able to see our random user generator. We're on V1. Anytime I want to come back into it, I just click this little pencil button. That'll bring us back to exactly to where we were. One thing you'll notice, I didn't actually have to save during this process. We auto-save the entire time for you, so you don't have to worry about it. Versioning, you also have the ability to change versions right up here. So if I click into that, you'll see which of the versions I use and which ones you can select. So, all right, let's go ahead and set up a connection with this. And assuming we're not overloading the API, we can actually take a look at the data. All right, so this is our shared demo workspace. If you've seen one of our demos before, you'll see we have a lot of existing connections. I'm just gonna go ahead and set up a brand new one. Let's hit new connection. It's gonna ask us if I wanna use any of the existing sources I've already established, but in this case, I actually wanna use a new source. And so we have quite a few sources established in this one, so it takes a little while to load. Let's go ahead and say set up a new source. Here, I'm going to search for random. There we go. See random user generator here. It has the Airbyte logo and has the custom tag, meaning it knows that you built it. It's not part of our repo or ones that we've necessarily certified. So let's click into that. The optional fields we established. So in this case, let's say results of, put that to 20 and seed Airbyte. Again, you don't have to fill those out. This is commonly where if you have like an API key or any auth creds, you definitely would fill those out here. But we're just going to go ahead and set up source. It's going to do a check. And so if the API is responsive and not sending 500 errors, we should get a pass. If it is having any issues here, it would say, hey, here's the problem. And you'd see like the particular error the API is going to throw. Now it's going to ask where we want to send this to. I'm going to actually set up a new destination so we can see this data. Let's use a Google Sheet. Google Sheet isn't one we generally recommend for anything production, but it's actually really easy or really helpful in these builders to just see your data quickly. So let's go into Google Sheet. Particularly if you're using our cloud product, it's really easy. You just OAuth in, which is what I'll do right now. On open source, it's actually a little bit trickier. You have to build your own auth app. So I generally recommend users either to using like a local file or just sending it to like a Snowflake table or a BigQuery table. All right, for this, I need a spreadsheet link. I already created a spreadsheet. You can either use the share or just grab it from the URL bar. Just throw that in here. It's at setup destination. It's going to do a check to make sure that we have access to this particular spreadsheet. If we do, we should get a pass. If there's any auth issues, it's going to let us know and we can resolve this here. All right. Awesome. Everything passed. All right. So let's go ahead and we're just going to set up this connection. We have it run. We're going to check some of that data and see what's, hopefully that it's working for us. This page here in particular, if you haven't seen this before, is generating our schema. So this is a discovering schema failed. This probably is doing with the API. My guess is it might be a little overloaded. We can take a look. I can download those logs, but let's go ahead and see if we can try again and see if it's just a temporary error. If there was a problem in the schema we created, which there certainly could be, we could go back into the builder and actually try to resolve it. And let's do that here in this case. This is actually a great example. So let's see if we can get into the builder and see what's going on. Let's take a look. I'm going to run it. Oh, sorry, wrong example. Let's jump into this one. And let's run a quick test and see. All right, everything here looks good. So that's good. The fact that we got a response from the API is promising. Let's drop, we can drop the error handling. I'll simplify things here and we can drop some of the transforms just to simplify the schema. Let's run a quick test. Everything's good. Cool. Let's release new version 2. Didn't include a description just to be quick. And let's jump back in. So one of the things, this actually is a good opportunity. I can say new connection. I'm going to use an existing source. Since we already set up that source, we don't have to do it again. So I can use random user generator. And I should have my Google Sheet. I don't know which one it is. So I'm going to set up it one more time since I didn't name it well. So I can't necessarily find it. I should have done that in this first place. I can do that here. Connector demo. That way if I need to find it again, I can. Let's grab this. Put the link in and let's OAuth in real quick. All right, give me permissions. All right, let's try it again. Again, if you, on the next page, we get that error again that usually points to a schema discovery and schema detection. How schemas are handled is very connector dependent. In this case, generally they're hard coded. That's what we've done with our discover, is saying you figure out the schema for us. If I could continue to get an error, I would actually, this is where I move to manually creating the schema. So I can come in and say, hey, maybe there's a type mismatch. Maybe that's what I'm saying here. And I can dig into like what's actually going on to that schema. I'm going to take a quick pause, and I think we've covered a lot of ground. Let me jump back into the builder. We can try to figure out what's happening with that particular schema. Again, my guess is we're probably getting some issues on the API if it's getting overwhelmed. But let's see if there's any particular questions that we haven't gotten to that we wanted to, because we have about 5 minutes left. And Keith, if there's anything you want me to focus on, let me know. All right, so there's questions about whether this is available in both open source and cloud. It is. We want all of our connectors to really be part of this low code and UI compatible format. It makes the maintenance and growth of our connector portfolio significantly easier. It makes it more accessible for, say, you're not just necessarily like a dev. You can be like a solutions engineer like myself and actually go ahead and update streams, fix incremental keys and primary keys and so forth. Let's see if there's anything else in the chat that we want to deal with. I don't see that. So let me go back. Let me take a look at this particular schema. I'm going to go ahead and turn off automatically import the schema. And the other thing you can do if you're running into schema issues is you make a larger sample size. I talked about that a little bit earlier. So let's actually set this up to be the max. Now it's going to take a little while to run when I set it that big, but let's run that test. This is really useful where if we were typing something maybe as a string or as a integer, but it actually has a potential to be a string, or we didn't find there could be a null, setting it to max is really helpful there. So I would encourage doing that. I can also set a pagination to pull a few more pages so we can get, that many more. So this is going to take a little bit longer. It's just waiting on the API to respond. So we see we have 1,000 records here. That's the most we'll load in any particular single request. If you want more, then we'd have to set up pagination. And let's take a look at the declared schema. I don't see anything that's too different, but let's try this now. I'll release it again. So one of the big values of the connector builder is how quickly it is to iterate and test. So I would encourage you just do a lot of quick test and learns. I could also dig into those logs that are generated and try to maybe pinpoint what's happening with the schema. So let's see if we can real quick set this up one more time. So I don't need to set up as a new source. Yeah, although we can. It doesn't take long to set up. Random user generator. I can skip the optional fields for now. Let's just go ahead and set up source and we'll see if we can get one row of data. All right, that's a good sign. We're able to actually access the API. Let's see if I can find my Google Sheet I used. Connector demo, here we go. Oh, that is a key of Airbyte. Once you set up a source or a destination, you never have to set it up again. And so it just allows you to do things a little bit easier. We're getting the same error here, so I can take a look at these logs, but I might have to do that a little bit of async, and I can publish this particular connection. Once I have it published, we'll share it out with all of our users, so you can access it yourself. You can replicate what we built, and so you should look for a follow-up where we'll share the YAML from this particular session. We'll figure out what's happening here and why the schema isn't being discovered. Otherwise, let's jump back. Keith, are there any other questions we want to tackle? It looks like most everything has been covered. Take one more look.
I think everything has been covered thus far.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, given that's the case, we love to hear from you. So if you guys have API sources you would like our help with, or you're just curious about the compatibility, please send those into us. Our team would love to work with you on those, hear them. And if we can work with you also on a path to get them added to our repo, we'd love to have that. That way we can share it with the rest of our community. Airbyte's real focus is growing this long tail of connectors and making it easy for all of our users like yourselves and our community to build the connectors, add them, maintain them, and grow the support for them. So don't hesitate, reach out. You can reach out to our team via that QR code there. Hit us up on our Slack community. We have a channel dedicated to troubleshooting any connectors. And so you can find that there, post your questions, and you usually see answers from either community members or the engineers who built a lot of this tech. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time today to attend this session. Really appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you all.